As Grace turned away from the grand estate, the sting of Richard Sterling's words echoed in her mind. The towering mansion, with its marble columns and perfectly manicured gardens, stood as a stark reminder of the gap between their worlds, one of immense wealth and privilege, and the other of hard work and perseverance. She clenched her fists, swallowing the lump in her throat, refusing to let his rejection break her spirit. She had faced worse in life and had always found a way to rise above it, but something nagged at her. That locket. The glimpse she caught of it hanging from Richard's suit pocket, it was unmistakable. The intricate floral pattern, the delicate golden chain, it was identical to the one her late mother had cherished, a treasured keepsake passed down through generations. It had been lost years ago, leaving Grace with only fading memories of its comforting weight against her skin. She paused at the estate's iron gates, the cold wind biting at her face, and glanced back at the mansion. Could it be a coincidence? Or was there something deeper? Something that connected her to the reclusive billionaire who had just turned her away so callously. Grace knew better than to dwell on what-ifs, but curiosity tugged at her relentlessly. She couldn't shake the thought that the locket might hold answers to questions she had long buried. How had it ended up with Richard Sterling, a man she had never met before today? And why did fate bring her to his doorstep at this moment? Determined not to let the incident slip into the forgotten corners of her mind, Grace resolved to find out more about the enigmatic billionaire. Asking around town, she learned that Richard was known for his ruthless business dealings, his guarded personal life, and his solitary existence inside the Sterling estate. No one really knew him beyond the headlines and whispers of his cold-hearted demeanor. Returning home to her modest apartment, Grace pulled out an old photo album filled with memories of her mother. As she flipped through the pages, her eyes landed on an image that made her heart skip a beat. There, in a faded black-and-white picture, was her mother standing outside a grand estate. This estate. Her fingers traced the edges of the photo, realization dawning in her eyes. There was a connection, and now, more than ever, she needed to uncover the truth. The rejection she had faced at Richard Sterling's door was no longer just an insult. It was a challenge. Grace knew she couldn't walk away from this. There was a secret buried in that mansion, and she was determined to uncover it no matter what it took. Grace couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the past held answers she wasn't ready to face. Sitting at her grandmother's kitchen table, surrounded by fading letters and yellowed documents, she carefully sifted through decades of family history. Her grandmother, a wise and patient woman, watched silently, her eyes filled with memories long buried. "I always suspected your mother had unfinished business in that house," her grandmother finally said, her voice soft but firm. "She never spoke much about her time there, but I could tell something happened, something she carried with her till the end." Grace held up a brittle envelope, its edges worn with age. As she unfolded the fragile paper inside, her heart pounded. It was a letter from her mother to her grandmother, dated decades ago. "Mama, things here at the Sterling estate are not what they seem. I've uncovered something I shouldn't have, and I don't know who to trust. Please keep Grace safe. I'll come home soon." Grace's eyes welled up with tears. Her mother had worked in that mansion. And from the fearful tone of the letter, it was clear she had left under mysterious and troubling circumstances. Rumors whispered through time suggested scandal, secrets, and lies hidden deep within those elegant walls. Whatever had driven her mother away had been serious enough to make her abandon everything. Fueled by determination and a newfound sense of purpose, Grace took a bold step. She applied for a temporary cleaning position through an agency that catered to the wealthy elite. It wasn't difficult. Rich people always needed someone to clean up their messes, and she was more than willing to do it, this time for answers. When Grace arrived at the Sterling estate as an official employee, she was struck by how little had changed since the last time she was there. The towering chandeliers, the intricate carvings on the staircase, the air of cold perfection. It was all just as she remembered from her childhood stories. Her heart pounded as she moved through the grand library, dusting shelves stacked with leather-bound books. As she reached the massive oak desk, her fingers traced over a small drawer handle, worn from years of use. Something compelled her to open it. Inside, she found old letters, their ink faded but still legible. One letter in particular caught her attention. It was unfinished, addressed to Richard from his estranged father. "Richard, I've made mistakes in my life, mistakes that haunt me every day. But the biggest one was keeping the truth from you. There was a woman, a kind soul, who deserved better than what happened. Her name was Eleanor, and she left because of choices I made, choices that changed everything." Grace's breath caught in her throat. Eleanor, her mother's name. The letter trembled in her hands as realization dawned. Her mother had been more than just a maid at the Sterling estate. There was a hidden chapter in Richard's life, one he had likely never known. Why had his father kept this secret from him? And why had her mother left so suddenly, never to return? Lost in thought, Grace didn't hear the approaching footsteps until it was too late. Richard's voice, cold and commanding, sliced through the air. "What are you doing in here?" he demanded, his piercing gaze locking onto her as she quickly stuffed the letter back into the drawer. Grace swallowed hard, her mind racing. "I was just cleaning, sir," she replied smoothly, though her heart was pounding. Richard eyed her suspiciously, but said nothing, walking past her with his usual air of authority. Grace exhaled slowly, realizing she had come dangerously close to being caught. But she couldn't stop now, not when she was so close to uncovering the truth. Over the following days, Grace meticulously worked her way through the estate, using her position to search for more clues. She overheard hushed conversations between the staff, picking up pieces of a puzzle she never knew existed. One butler whispered about a scandal that had rocked the Sterling family years ago, while an elderly housekeeper spoke in riddles about things that were better left in the past. Piece by piece, Grace uncovered the shadow that loomed over the estate, the secret that Richard had spent his life trying to forget, and the truth her mother had left behind. As she stood alone in the grand hall one evening, staring at a portrait of Richard's father hanging over the fireplace, she whispered to herself, "Whatever this secret is, it's time for it to come out." The attic was dark and musty, filled with forgotten memories and dust-covered relics of the Sterling family's past. Grace had been sent up to tidy the space, but her instincts told her that this room held more than just forgotten furniture and cobwebs. As she moved carefully through the clutter, her eyes fell on an old wooden chest tucked away in the farthest corner, partially hidden beneath an old velvet cloth. Curiosity gnawed at her, and with trembling hands she lifted the lid. Inside, she found a collection of black and white photographs, yellowed documents, and delicate trinkets that hinted at a history far more complicated than she had imagined. But it was the birth certificate lying beneath the pile that made her heart pound in her chest. The name on it stopped her cold. Eleanor Sterling. Her mother. Grace's breath hitched as she scanned the document, her eyes widening with disbelief. The father's name listed on the certificate? Jonathan Sterling, Richard's father. It took a moment for the weight of the revelation to settle in. Richard Sterling wasn't just a cold billionaire who had dismissed her without a second thought. He was family, her uncle. The realization sent shivers down her spine. All her life, Grace had believed that she and her mother were alone, struggling through hardships with no one to turn to. And yet, here she was, standing in a mansion that could have been part of her own heritage, staring at proof that Richard Sterling had unknowingly turned his own niece away at the door. Folding the birth certificate carefully, she sat back on her heels, staring at the chest full of forgotten secrets. The weight of the truth pressed heavily on her chest. Her mother had left this house under mysterious circumstances, but why? Had she been forced out? Had Richard known all along, or was he just as much in the dark as she had been? Determined to find answers, Grace carefully gathered the documents and placed them in a neat envelope. She addressed it to Richard Sterling and held it tightly in her hands, knowing that this confrontation could change everything. The next morning, Grace stood at the foot of the grand staircase, her heart hammering in her chest as Richard descended with his usual air of importance. He barely glanced at her, as though she were invisible, but not today. "This isn't just about cleaning your mansion, Mr. Sterling," she said firmly, extending the envelope toward him. "It's about cleaning up the past you've been running from." Richard paused mid-step, narrowing his eyes at her audacity. "Excuse me?" he said, irritation lacing his voice. Grace didn't waver. "Please, just read it." With a scoff, he took the envelope, opening it with disinterest, until his eyes fell on the birth certificate. His expression shifted from irritation to shock, his hands trembling as he turned the paper over, reading it again as if he couldn't believe his own eyes. What is this?" he muttered, his voice suddenly hoarse. "It's the truth," Grace said softly. "My mother, Eleanor Sterling. She was your sister." Richard's face paled, and for a moment, the powerful billionaire looked fragile, like a man who had just discovered his entire life was built on half-truths and secrets. He staggered slightly, gripping the edge of the railing for support. This isn't possible," he whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. "It is," Grace replied, her voice steady. "And I think deep down, you know it. That locket you carry? My mother had the same one. She left this house because of something your father did." Richard ran a shaky hand through his hair, his mind racing. Memories flooded back, fleeting glimpses of a young girl his father used to mention in hushed tones, an estranged, distant relative they never spoke of openly. He had always brushed it aside, never questioning why certain family portraits were removed, why his father became distant when the past was mentioned. Taking a deep breath, Richard finally looked at Grace, really looked at her for the first time. I didn't know," he admitted, his voice carrying a hint of regret. "I didn't know she was my sister." Grace nodded, the emotion in her chest threatening to overwhelm her. "I believe you," she said softly, "but now you do. And it's time you stop pretending the past doesn't matter." Richard swallowed hard, staring down at the birth certificate once more. A heavy silence stretched between them before he finally whispered, "What happened to her?" Grace's lips trembled, but she held herself together. "She passed away a few years ago. She worked hard her entire life, never asking for anything, and I grew up never knowing the family we could have had." Richard's eyes darkened with regret, his stoic facade cracking just enough for Grace to see the man behind the wealth, the man who had unknowingly lost something precious without even realizing it. A long pause followed before he finally said, "Come with me. I think it's time we talk." As he led her toward his private study, Grace felt a strange sense of closure begin to form. She had uncovered the truth, and now it was time to see what Richard Sterling would do with it. Richard sat in his grand study, the birth certificate trembling in his hands. His eyes traced the name over and over, Eleanor Sterling. It felt surreal, like a cruel joke played by fate. He leaned back in his leather chair, exhaling sharply as the weight of the truth pressed down on him. The carefully constructed world he had built, one of wealth, order, and control, was now cracked by a truth he never saw coming. Grace stood silently across from him, her arms crossed, watching him struggle with the reality she had carried her whole life. She could see the flicker of disbelief, the resistance to accept what was right in front of him. But she also saw something else, an unfamiliar vulnerability in his usually cold, detached expression. "I didn't know," Richard finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I had no idea." He looked up at Grace, his piercing eyes softer than before, filled with something she never thought she'd see. Guilt. Grace sighed, nodding slowly. "I believe you," she said, her voice firm but calm. "But the truth is, my mother left because she felt like she didn't belong. Your father, he made sure of that." Richard swallowed hard, memories of his father resurfacing. His father had been a strict, proud man who valued status above all else. He had always been secretive about the past, brushing aside questions with vague answers. Now Richard understood why. "I owe you an apology," Richard said, his voice cracking slightly, "for dismissing you. For everything." Grace studied him for a moment, surprised by his sincerity. "Apologies are a start," she said, offering a small but cautious smile. "But real change takes more than words." Richard nodded slowly, rubbing his temples as he processed the reality of what she was saying. "You're right. I don't want to just apologize. I want to make things right." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "Stay. Not as a maid, but as someone who can help me understand everything I missed." Grace's eyebrows shot up in surprise. She had come here for answers, not expecting an invitation to stay. But deep down, she felt the same pull, an urge to reconnect with a past she never truly knew. "You mean it?" she asked cautiously. Richard nodded. "I do. I want to know more about my sister. About you." His voice, usually so authoritative, now carried a gentleness Grace never thought possible. Reluctantly, she agreed. Over the next few days, Grace found herself navigating the halls of the estate in a new light. No longer confined to the role of a maid, she had the freedom to explore the history that connected her to this place. Together, she and Richard sifted through more old letters, faded photographs, and journals hidden in the depths of the estate's many rooms. As they pieced together their family's past, Richard began to change. The once aloof and distant billionaire found himself listening more, asking questions about his sister he never had the chance to know. Grace shared stories of her mother's warmth and resilience, painting a picture of Eleanor far different from the forgotten ghost in Richard's mind. In return, Richard opened up about his own struggles, how he had spent his life chasing success, distancing himself from personal relationships, and shutting people out. "I thought keeping people at a distance was the best way to stay in control," he admitted one evening as they sat by the fireplace, sorting through old photo albums. "But I see now that I've lost more than I gained." Grace watched him closely, recognizing the cracks in the walls he had so carefully built around himself. "People aren't just numbers, Richard," she said gently. "They're the reason we fight, the reason we push forward. My mom always said that family is more than blood. It's about showing up, about caring." Richard nodded, taking in her words. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him, something that had been buried beneath years of business deals and boardroom meetings. Together, they began reaching out to the extended family they never knew existed, reconnecting with distant relatives who still held pieces of Eleanor's story. Grace helped Richard organize events at the estate, inviting people from the community his father had once ignored. The house, once a symbol of cold, lifeless wealth, began to feel like a home. Richard's transformation didn't go unnoticed by those around him. His employees, once fearful of his icy demeanor, saw a new side of him, one that showed humility, empathy, and a willingness to listen. The town, too, took note of his involvement in community programs and charitable efforts led by Grace, slowly shifting their perception of the once unreachable billionaire. Despite his newfound warmth, Richard still carried the weight of regret. "I wish I had known her," he admitted to Grace one day as they stood in the garden where Eleanor had once spent countless afternoons. "She would have liked you," Grace replied softly, "once you got past the whole cold businessman thing." Richard chuckled, a rare, genuine smile crossing his face. "I suppose it's not too late to start changing that, huh?" Grace smiled back. "Not at all. Change isn't easy, but it's possible." As the sun set over the grand estate, Richard knew that his life had taken a turn he never expected, and it was all because of Grace, the niece he had once turned away, but who had returned not only to find answers but to help him rebuild a family he never knew he had. And in that moment, Richard Sterling realized that true wealth wasn't measured in money, but in the connections we make and the hearts we touch along the way. Months had passed, and the Sterling estate was no longer the cold, lifeless fortress it once was. Grace's presence had brought more than just a fresh perspective. It had breathed life into the grand halls, filling them with laughter, purpose, and a sense of belonging that had long been absent. the once sterile mansion, ruled by rigid schedules and distant interactions, now welcomed community events, family gatherings, and acts of kindness that extended beyond its high walls. Richard, inspired by Grace's unwavering strength and the legacy of his late sister, took meaningful steps to honor his newfound family. With Grace's guidance, he established the Eleanor Sterling Foundation, dedicated to providing scholarships and job opportunities for those who, like Grace's mother, had been overlooked by society. The foundation quickly gained traction, becoming a beacon of hope for aspiring students and hardworking individuals eager for a chance to prove themselves. The night of the Grand Charity Gala arrived, an event unlike any the Sterling estate had ever hosted. The lavish ballroom, once a place reserved for the social elite, now welcomed a diverse crowd: scholars, community leaders, and employees who had worked tirelessly behind the scenes. Grace stood at the edge of the room, watching as Richard moved through the crowd, shaking hands and engaging in conversations that once would have felt beneath him. As the evening reached its peak, Richard took the stage, tapping the microphone gently. The room fell silent, anticipation hanging in the air. He looked out over the audience, his eyes briefly settling on Grace before he spoke. "Tonight is not just about charity," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's about redemption. It's about honoring those we've lost and embracing those we've found." A murmur spread through the crowd as he continued. "For years, I lived my life in isolation, believing that wealth could shield me from the past. But fate had other plans, and it came knocking in the form of a young woman with an incredible spirit." Richard took a deep breath and turned to face Grace directly. "Grace is not just an employee who walked through my doors. She's family. She's my niece. And through her, I've learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about having the courage to seek the truth and the strength to embrace it when it finally stands before you." The crowd gasped in surprise, whispers rippling through the ballroom, but Richard didn't falter. "Tonight, I want to publicly acknowledge Grace, not just for her perseverance, but for reminding me of the values I had long forgotten." He extended a hand toward her, inviting her to join him on stage. Grace, overwhelmed but proud, stepped forward, her heart pounding as she took Richard's hand. The applause that followed wasn't just for her, it was for the journey they had both taken, one of discovery, healing, and reconciliation. As they stood together, Grace realized something profound. Her persistence had not only uncovered a hidden family connection, but had also sparked a transformation in Richard, one that had turned a man consumed by wealth and pride into someone who valued connection and legacy above all else. Later that night, as guests mingled and laughter filled the air, Richard pulled Grace aside. "Thank you," he said quietly, sincerity evident in his voice, "for not giving up, for showing me that it's never too late to change." Grace smiled warmly. "You did the hard part, Richard. You chose to listen." In that moment, they both knew that their lives had changed forever. The walls that once separated them had crumbled, and in their place stood a bond built on truth, resilience, and newfound hope. As Grace watched the guests leave with smiles and inspiration, she felt a sense of fulfillment she had never known before. The legacy of her mother had found a new home, not in the grand chandeliers or gold-lined walls, but in the hearts of those who had come together in the Sterling estate that night. And for Richard, the once isolated billionaire, the future finally felt like something worth embracing.